As the adaptation of Suzanne Collins' prequel to The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, gears up for its November 2023 release, I'm venturing back to review each book in the Hunger Games trilogy. That's right, 15 years after the fact, the last YouTuber over the finish line is here to bring you his hot take on the series. But the only advantage I'm actually grateful for regarding having completely missed the hype around the series is the fact that I have completely missed the hype around the series. The Hunger Games trilogy has become a literary and cultural phenomenon. Millions of copies of the books have been purchased, the books were referenced in mainstream media, taught in schools, and have even been the subject of academic conferences. And all of this happened before the first movie was released. But I'm actually a little happy that I was too lazy to jump on the bandwagon when this was more relevant, because I think I can now give it a fair review. To an extent, the Hunger Games trilogy phenomenon can be understood as being part of a larger cultural trend, one that became visible when the Harry Potter books went to the top of the New York Times bestseller list in 1999 and stayed there until the Times created a separate list for children's books to, quote, clear some room for books written for adults. Like the Harry Potter series and the Twilight Saga, the Hunger Games trilogy appeals to a very broad demographic, as evidenced by overall sales in the millions. The books are popular with readers of all ages. But the Hunger Games trilogy is different from the other two series in the nature of its appeal. Suzanne Collins' work is cynical and ironic in ways that Harry Potter and Twilight are not. In Hunger Games, justice doesn't exist and freedom is an illusion, and the trilogy ends with the main character being used up psychologically and emotionally. The Hunger Games trilogy, of course, is a product of its era, just like every other cultural artifact. The appearance of the first volume of Collins' series coincided almost exactly with the beginning of the world economic crisis that began in late 2008. Although critics could hardly argue that the Hunger Games represents a reaction to the crisis because the volume was completed before the crash, the mood of the time shaped its reception. The book's biting irony matched the mood of the times when everyone faced a very real prospect of economic ruin. The Hunger Games is a dark book for a dark time. Recognizing the importance of Collins' work, I will try to analyze the Hunger Games trilogy from a number of literary and cultural perspectives in an effort to better understand both its significance and its appeal. In this video, I'm also assuming that you are familiar with all three volumes, and therefore I will avoid plot summaries, instead focusing on the significance of the story and its characters. Nothing grinds my gears quite like tuning into an analysis that devolves into nothing more than a bare bones plot summary. This video might also be lengthy, so if you wish to skip to a certain section that interests you the most, you can do so using these references on your screen or the ones in the video description. So let's get started. Of the three volumes, the first is the most linear, events being presented for the most part as they happen by a first-person narrator who uses the present tense almost exclusively. Things soon become messy, however, not just for Katniss but also for the readers, who must figure out what is happening from a narrator who herself is overwhelmed and confused. The trilogy is also messy in terms of genre. People view the books differently, as romance, as dystopian, as action-adventure, as political, as science fiction novel, or even a survivor story. Although Collins partakes in all these genres, she adheres to the conventions of none, confounding the expectations of readers and critics alike as the story continually changes direction. Collins' work defies easy genre classification. It is young adult fiction that addresses themes usually reserved for adults, a science fiction novel that is largely unconcerned with science and technology, a dystopian fiction that ends hopefully, at least on a societal level, a survivor story in which the survivor never fully recovers, and a series in which the protagonist regresses as much as she progresses. Some readers, of course, find the trilogy frustrating for this very reason. They expect their romances to end romantically, their dystopias to end hopelessly, their adventure stories to end triumphantly. For other readers, however, this is one of the trilogy's strengths because it is so unconventional, it is impossible to predict what is going to happen from chapter to chapter, making the story that much more engaging. Finally, the trilogy is complicated thematically. Even though Collins considers the novels to be, quote, first and foremost, war stories, the war against the capital begins only in the third volume, the first two concerning themselves with themes such as family, friendship, love, trauma, governance, personal responsibility, and ethics. The fact that the author considers The Hunger Games, a novel that never even mentions the possibility of a war against the capital, to be a war story indicates just how complicated her thinking about the subject is. War cannot be separated from themes such as family, friendship, love, and everything else because they are all interrelated. In order to understand war, she seems to suggest we need to understand what it means to be human. And the same goes for all her other themes. None can be understood in isolation since they all connect with everything else. However, maybe Collins's ideas do not need sorting out. If Katniss's story were easy to follow, if the novel were easy to classify, if Collins's themes were easy to discern, then the Hunger Games trilogy would tell us little about the world we live in or how we might go about changing it. What makes Collins's work worth discussing is its difficulty. Not that it is difficult to read, of course, you can finish it in one sitting, but it is difficult to process and digest. Now, the first book opens up with the sentence, "When I wake up, the other side of the bed is cold." I can't imagine anyone recognizing that opening unless you're obsessed with the book, and upon reading this for the first time, I thought it wasn't a great first sentence. It seemed lazy to begin a book with a hero waking up in the morning. However, after reading the whole series and coming back to it, it's actually a good first sentence because it implies that she lacks a companion to sleep with, which is the tension of the whole series. The entire opening section is about the lack of love. Her bed is cold because her sister isn't in it. The cat, whom she had almost killed years before, hates her. This is the closest we will ever come to love. Her father was torn apart by an explosion. It's also cold and lonely. Even her interaction with Gale is about the rejection of the possibility of love. The only thing she has is her sister, who is talked about more than seen. Prim is more of an idea than a character here, the one person Katniss loves. Despite that, the story starts with Prim having left their joint bed to be with their mother. The love is distant. And as readers, we're asking ourselves, is she the kind of person who actually doesn't need to wake up next to anyone? And then comes the big moment, when Katniss, a cold girl in a cold world, with a love we see more abstract than real, takes a catastrophic action out of unselfish love. It's fitting that Peeta is selected after Katniss has emotionally awakened. We can also notice that Collins sustains a first-person narrative, and does so excellently by making Katniss an extremely dynamic character who changes not just over the course of the trilogy, but over the course of each individual volume. For example, in the Hunger Games, she goes from being a detached young woman who allows herself to care only for her younger sister to someone who learns to connect with other people and even become emotionally dependent upon them. In Mockingjay, the change she undergoes over the course of the novel are even more apparent since the book both begins and ends in District 12, providing a point of comparison. As she walks through what remains of her still smoldering home at the beginning of the book, she reports her interior states almost continually, verbalizing not only her thoughts, but her emotions, which include guilt, hate, and regret. Although traumatized by her experiences in the Quarter Quell, she is still engaged with the world, communicating not only what she sees and hears, but how the leather of her father's old hunting jacket feels against her skin and the smell of the white rose President Snow leaves for her on her dresser. When she walks through the same place less than a year later, the detached way in which she reports things suggests that she's essentially a different person. She speaks of a mass grave in the meadow, for example, but does not describe it in any detail or report her thoughts or feelings about it. Ironically, Katniss's silence reveals more about her interior state than any description could. Because of the various forms of trauma she has undergone, she has lost not only the ability to articulate how she feels, but the ability to feel itself. Despite employing the same first-person narrator through the trilogy, Collins succeeds in conveying the stories of other characters as well, something that is remarkable given the fact that Katniss is emotionally detached, if not catatonic, throughout much of the narrative. Katniss provides details in bits and pieces as she reports brief exchanges between herself and others, or as she reflects upon things momentarily. For example, the reader learns about the relationship between Katniss's father and mother over the course of all three novels through references to things such as the depression her mother fell into after the father dies, how Katniss's father won the mother over with his voice, how her mother yelled at him for teaching Katniss the hanging tree, and how she ran to the mines on the day of his fatal accident, not even checking on her children. Through the careful placement of detail, the reader gets a strong sense of not only their relationship, but Katniss's home life before the accident, even though little is actually said about it. Through the strategic use of the present tense, fine-grained detail, proper nouns, articles, and adverbs, Collins is able to make Katniss's world more immediately available to the reader. For example, when in Catching Fire, President Snow appears in District 12 to inform Katniss that she must continue her showmance with Peeta, she describes the large desk of polished wood where he sits, adding that it is where Prim does her homework, another fine-grained detail to enable readers to more fully visualize the setting. In addition to making the text more engaging, Collins' use of the present tense and other devices to create a sense of immediacy puts the reader in a position to interpret Katniss's experiences independently of her, at least to an extent. Since Katniss reports her experiences in the past, they are not influenced by her memory, and therefore readers have more immediate access to them. This is not to suggest that readers have unfiltered access to Katniss's experience. Of course, Katniss chooses what to report and how to report it. Readers are not limited to her interpretation of those experiences, since in a limited sort of way, they co-experience them. For example, in The Hunger Games, when Katniss reports that ants crawl out of her blistered hands, travel up her arms, and bore into her eyes, readers may realize what Katniss does not, that she is not literally being eaten by ants, the sensation instead being the result of trackerjacker venom. The ability to interpret events independently of Katniss becomes critical at certain points in the text, since Katniss's perceptions are sometimes severely affected by her circumstances, most obviously when she's under the influence of sleep syrup in Catching Fire and Morphling in Mockingjay. Her psychological reactions to the various forms of trauma she undergoes also affect her reliability at times, since they make it difficult for her to differentiate between what is real and what is unreal, leaving it to readers to determine for themselves what is happening and what to think about it. Toward the beginning of The Hunger Games, Katniss recounts how, upon being driven away from the trash bins near the bakery when seeking food for her starving family by Peeta's mother, she gives in to despair, losing the power to act. Provided with a burnt loaf of bread by Peeta, however, she regains the strength to continue, and the next day, upon seeing the first dandelion of the season, she realizes that she can save herself and her family by employing knowledge she has acquired from her father while hunting in the woods with him and building upon it. On one level, seeing the dandelion helps Katniss find a course of action, one that is essential to her physical survival. On another level, however, seeing the dandelion initiates a new way of being for Katniss. She realizes that she must be active rather than passive in order to survive, that doing something is better than doing nothing, since at the very least, action provides a means of acquiring new knowledge that might prove critical. Rather than accept the situation she finds herself in after her father's death and slowly starve to death along with her mother and sister, Katniss, who is only 11 at the time, adapts, transforming herself from a dependent into a provider. She has to hunt for food in her father's stead and engages in illegal commerce in order to gain other necessities. Although moving from passive to active proves essential to Katniss's survival after her father dies, she quickly learns that action is not enough in itself. She must learn to act intelligently, putting theory into practice and using outcomes to refine her original plan. In effect, she becomes a pragmatist, utilizing the information at hand to act even though that information may be incomplete or unreliable, so as to put herself in a position to acquire better information and as a result attain more satisfactory outcomes. As the trilogy proceeds, she becomes increasingly adept at making informed decisions and is ultimately able to act in ways that not only improve her situation, but that of society at large. Among her greatest strengths is her awareness of her own ignorance, something that is made evident by the way she harvests plants. When she's unsure of something, she researches it to the best of her ability, repeatedly consulting a book with detailed pictures of edible plants so as to minimize risk. She does not rely entirely upon received knowledge, however, rather she challenges herself, continually learning and even developing new tricks when it comes to trading and trapping. When Katniss enters the arena, it becomes clear that there, at least, the general ability to master new skills is the most valuable skill of all, since she can easily adapt to new situations. As a pragmatist, she addresses problems by identifying a promising approach, implementing it, analyzing the results, and then reconsidering her original hypothesis. For example, when looking for water towards the start of the games, she decides that since water runs downhill, she should follow the downward slopes rather than rises, even though she's more comfortable at higher altitudes, valleys making her feel trapped. Although the strategy yields no immediate results, she reasons that if she were heading in the wrong direction, then Haymitch would have had her sponsors provide her with enough water to survive. In other words, she treats the fact that she's now receiving water as a piece of valuable information and acts accordingly, continuing in the same direction rather than reacting emotionally and turning back. Katniss's penchant for acting upon a hypothesis, assessing the result, and then re-hypothesizing serves her again and again while she's in the arena, helping her to work out a plan to escape the career pack after they have trapped her in a tree, to locate Peeta, who has hidden himself in some mud, and to gain support from sponsors by feigning a romance with Peeta. Her pragmatism even helps her come up with this scheme that forces the game makers to change the rules and allow both her and Peeta to be victors. Through intelligent practice, it seems, Katniss has figured out how the games work and gone on to become their master. In Catching Fire, Katniss again demonstrates how intelligent practice can lead to better outcomes in the way she develops alliances with other tributes in the Quarter Quell, particularly Finnick Odair. At first, she is repelled by Finnick, not only because he seems decadent, but because he's overly familiar with her, and in a later dream, she associates him with Snow. Her attitude towards him begins to change, however, as she acquires new information. As it turns out, Katniss's ability to move beyond her initial dislike of Finnick by continually reassessing him on the basis of new information proves to be key to her survival, not only in the Quarter Quell arena, but later in the capital when he sacrifices his life so that Katniss can escape the mutts that are pursuing her and continue on her mission to kill Snow. Katniss also moves between conjecture, action, and observation to escape the Quarter Quell arena by bringing down the force field that surrounds it. Whereas in the Hunger Games and Catching Fire, Katniss demonstrates not only initiative, but also the ability to adapt her understanding as new information emerges. In the beginning of Mockingjay, Katniss has seemingly lost all capacity for action, wondering if there's any point in doing anything at all. That Katniss is essentially paralyzed should not be surprising, of course, given the trauma she experiences in the Quarter Quell and afterwards. She has killed one person and witnessed the death of several others. She has been knocked unconscious by Joanna Mason, who also removed a tracking device from her arm with a knife, severely injuring her. Her friend and ally Peeta has been captured by the Capitol, her home district has been destroyed, and most of the people she has known are dead. She has been relocated to District 13, where she has been classified as mentally disoriented, and she has been put on morphling, a powerful medication that makes her hallucinate. No longer able to sort out what is true and what is false because of the horrors she has endured, she recites to herself the short list of things she can be certain of, such as her name and age, working towards more complicated things, rebuilding her world from little to big. However, she has only limited success in this. Although Katniss's mind begins to clear in some ways as time passes, she remains incapable of intelligent practice throughout much of Mockingjay, behaving impulsively rather than thinking through how to best achieve her desired outcome and adjusting her strategies and tactics as her information changes. Despite her impetuousness, her actions often seem to have positive outcomes. For example, when she breaks from her bodyguards during a bombing raid in District 8, scales a building and shoots down a number of the attacking aircraft with her bow, actions that are captured on video and incorporated in a powerful propaganda piece. Uniformed actions like these sometimes have unforeseen negative consequences, as evidenced by the fact that her heroics on top of the building lead to Peeta being tortured in the Capitol. Once Katniss realizes that her performances as the Mockingjay only cause further suffering on Peeta's part, she again becomes paralyzed, seemingly incapable of formulating a new strategy for assisting the rebels without hurting Peeta. Even after Peeta is rescued by District 13 operatives, Katniss remains reactive, unable to think things through completely or adapt her behaviors when new information becomes available because she's preoccupied by Peeta's poor mental condition. Rather than assess her goals and work out possible ways of achieving them as she does in the Hunger Games and Catching Fire, she throws herself into dangerous situations. For example, almost being killed in District 2 while single-handedly confronting the armed survivors of the Capitol's main base there. Before fully recovering from her severe injuries caused by being shot in the abdomen, she behaves impulsively again, insisting that she be included in the assault upon the Capitol only because it may give her an opportunity to revenge herself upon Snow. Rather than being given an opportunity to hunt Snow, however, she is assigned to a squad that is supposed to create footage for propaganda films rather than fight. The Hunger Games trilogy is also a pragmatist text in the sense that it suggests that morality is neither absolute nor relative, but instead contingent upon outcomes and how they are achieved. Some people might believe there's always a right choice because of fixed rules about what's good and bad. That's absolute morality. Others might think the right choice can change depending on the situation or person. That's relative morality. Pragmatism is a bit different from both of these ideas. In the Hunger Games, the author Suzanne Collins shows us that sometimes what's right or wrong is really about looking at what happens because of the choices people make. It's not just about having a good goal, the end, or about choosing a specific way to do things, the means. It's about thinking, if I do this, what will happen? Is that outcome something I can live with? In addition to considering the ethical implications of various types of actions, Collins explores the ethics of inaction, suggesting that refusing to act can be just as significant as acting. Sometimes moral questions immediately present themselves as questions whose solutions cannot wait for sensible proof. Collins suggests that there are times when one must choose to act even though the information available may be incomplete, so long as one is willing to change one's course of action as better information is acquired. In general, Katniss does just that. Although she sometimes behaves impetuously, such as when she takes Prim's place in the Hunger Games or faces the armed survivors of the Nut by herself, she usually considers numerous possibilities and is willing to change course if necessary. For example, although reluctant to be the Mockingjay because she knows that joining the rebellion will put people at risk, including those she loves the most, she agrees to take on the role when she realizes that the Capitol must be defeated no matter what the cost. The decision is provisional, however, and upon recognizing that District 13 is in some ways as bad as the Capitol, she effectively deserts the rebel army and begins acting independently again. On occasion, however, she finds herself unable to act, for example, when she sees a boy and girl running for their lives through the woods outside of District 12 and becomes immobilized. Rather than try to help, Katniss and Gale only watch as the girl is captured and the boy is killed. Reflecting upon this later, Katniss wonders if she and Gale could have helped them escape if they had moved quickly enough. Eventually, she takes moral responsibility for her inaction and apologizes to the girl, who she later learns is named Lavinia, telling her that she should have tried to save her. Collins's representation of Katniss's misgivings about failing to have acted raises important ethical questions about the circumstances under which one is obliged to take risks on behalf of others. Although Lavinia signals to Katniss that any attempt to save her most likely would have resulted in Katniss's own capture or death, Katniss continues to feel guilty about her inaction, counting Lavinia as one of the many who has died because of her. The same seems to hold true when Finnick is killed before her eyes by the lizard-like mutts that are coming for her. There's nothing she could have done to save them, and therefore her failure to take action cannot be considered unethical. Indeed, Katniss comes to recognize this on some level, forcing herself to move on, telling herself that there will be time for human feelings later. Katniss's decision to kill Coin rather than Snow can also be better understood in terms of pragmatist ethics than in terms of absolute morality or moral relativity. Upon returning to the capital after Prim's death, Katniss has no intention of assassinating Coin. She blames Snow for the death of her sister and has every intention of executing him herself, Coin having saved him for her. At this point, her insistence upon being the one to kill Snow seems to be motivated primarily by a desire to revenge the death of her sister, even though such a desire may be understandable given the horrors Snow has inflicted not only upon Katniss and her family but upon all of Panem. Executing Snow would only be justifiable from a pragmatic point of view if the action could be reasonably expected to significantly benefit either Katniss or others. Rather than bringing her any long-term psychological relief, it seems likely that revenging herself upon Snow, who is no longer in power and therefore can no longer harm others, would only make her psychological situation worse, since his name would just be added to the long list of the dead that has haunted her since the opening pages of Mockingjay. As Katniss herself suggests, once Snow is dead, nothing will be left but for her to die herself. Executing Snow is unlikely to benefit Panem either, because in doing so, Katniss would only again be serving as a piece in President Coin's game, helping her in her efforts to become the unchallenged ruler of all Panem. To Coin, Katniss is a political obstacle since Katniss, who may have more influence than any other single person, neither likes her nor approves of her. By arranging for Katniss to execute Snow publicly while dressed in her Mockingjay outfit, Coin hopes to symbolically put an end to not only the Capitol's rule of Panem, but also of Katniss's career as a public figure. Once the Mockingjay kills Snow, the revolution is complete and the new regime, led by Coin, can take over. Katniss has recognized that Coin is just as much of a tyrant as Snow, that the Republic that the rebels have been fighting for will never come to be as long as Coin has political supremacy. When Coin demands that the surviving tributes vote on whether to reinstitute the Hunger Games, Katniss realizes that she must take action, that she has a moral responsibility to do whatever she can to end the cycle of violence and destruction that has been going on in Panem for more than 75 years. Realizing that arguing against reinstituting the Hunger Games in Coin's presence will only make Coin more wary of her, she thinks everything through and votes for her final games, hoping that her compliance will lead Coin to let her guard down and make her action against her possible. Katniss's strategy works. No longer feeling threatened by Katniss, Coin makes a public appearance at what is supposed to be Snow's execution and ends up being killed herself. No longer a piece of anyone else's games, Katniss takes definitive action because to do any less would be unethical. Not surprisingly, perhaps, this is just what Collins hopes her readers will do. Think about whatever situation they find themselves in, decide whether it's right or wrong, and if it's wrong, decide what part they're going to play in changing it. Through Katniss, she tries to teach her readers that pragmatism involves not only knowing what is right, but doing right. The Hunger Games trilogy is very much a survivor's story. That is, an attempt by someone who has escaped ongoing trauma to narrate her experiences so as to better come to terms with them on a personal level, as well as to put them on record for society's benefit. The trilogy presents Katniss as a survivor, that is, as someone who regains control over her life following a series of traumas, thus providing readers with potential inspiration to take the initiative and improve their own situations. Although readers are unlikely to undergo the sorts of trauma Katniss does, they nonetheless may benefit from her example as she struggles to not only save herself and her loved ones, but make her world a better place for others. Katniss's life seems to be defined by trauma. Katniss, having lost her father to whom she was very close in a mining accident, Katniss, who was just 11 at the time, is unable to grieve for her father properly, being pressed into providing for her family by herself because of the crushing depression that her mother fell into following the father's death. Katniss's mother has been suffering immobilized sadness. It is only after she has suffered similar symptoms herself following Prim's death in Mockingjay that Katniss can understand that her mother was locked in some dark world of sadness, that she has a sickness and is not just being weak. Katniss too seems to suffer following her father's death, the malady presenting itself in a very different way than it does in her mother. Rather than clock out entirely as her mother does, Katniss suffers from bad dreams, is continually anxious, and has difficulty forming relationships with other people. It takes her years to regard Gale as anything more than a hunting partner, and she refuses to accept Madge as her friend even though they eat lunch and attend assemblies together at school and partner up for physical activities. For the most part, Katniss attributes her emotional detachment from others to her circumstances at the time. She tells herself that she cannot afford to enter into a relationship with other people because it is all she can do to provide for her family, and after she becomes a tribute to keep herself alive. On some level, though, she seems to recognize that there's a psychological cause as well, noting, for example, that she has put up a wall to protect herself from needing her mother. Only gradually does she realize that she must let herself depend upon other people, physically and emotionally, as she once did with her father, and even then she keeps Peeta, Madge, and later Finnick at a distance, accepting their friendship only reluctantly. Like many people, Katniss cannot begin to recover from trauma until she addresses it. The loss of a loved one is not the only form of trauma Katniss faces in the trilogy, of course. In the 74th Hunger Games, she also undergoes physical trauma repeatedly, being burned badly by a fireball, stung by tracker jackers, and nearly killed by a knife thrown by Clove. In the Quarter Quell, she fares little better, being seriously injured once when Joanna knocks her unconscious with a heavy coil of wire and then removes the tracking device from her forearm by cutting it out. She is critically injured in Mockingjay as well, being shot in the abdomen by a refugee from District 2 and later being severely burned in the bomb blasts that end up killing Prim. She also experiences various forms of emotional trauma, witnessing the horrific deaths not only of people she has come to care about, but those of people she herself has killed, such as Glimmer and Cato. She's also traumatized by the sufferings of others, including her mother, Peeta, Gale, Finnick, and even Haymitch. Finally, she has witnessed horrific events such as the bombing of a hospital, the burying alive of the people within the Nut, and the slaughter of children and medical workers outside of President Snow's mansion, Prim being among those killed. Katniss starts off the series scarred and ends the series severely traumatized. Despite her mental health issues, Katniss continues to meet her responsibilities as best she can in the first part of Mockingjay, sometimes using her duties as the Mockingjay to distract her from her pain, finding it easier to fight in District 2 than to face Peeta after he attempts to kill her, for example. She also finds a certain amount of relief through occupational therapy, tying and untying knots as Finnick does, and after being injured in District 2, resorting to morphine, a powerful narcotic. In addition, her interactions with others suffering with the same issues help her, as does advice she receives from Joanna Mason about accepting that trauma changes people permanently, and so it is best just to get on with things. None of the above strategies are adequate once her sister dies, however. Severely burned by the same blast that killed Prim, Katniss loses both her sense of self and her ability to differentiate between the real and the unreal. Whereas earlier in the novel she is able to employ a technique she learned from a psychiatrist to reorient herself, listing the simplest things she knows to be true and working toward the more complicated, now it is all she can do to continue moment to moment, apparently unable to separate who she really is from the various roles she has been assigned by others. Katniss Everdeen, the survivor who took on adult responsibilities at age 11 and later becomes a Hunger Games victor, the girl who was on fire, a media persona carefully constructed by Cinna to project both innocence and danger, a love-crazed schoolgirl who would rather kill herself than lose Peeta, a superhero-like Mockingjay created by Plutarch and others to represent the symbol of revolution, or a renegade soldier who violates her orders in order to pursue a personal vendetta against President Snow. In short, she loses her sense of self. Unable to separate dreams from reality, she describes herself as Cinna's bird ignited, flying frantically to escape something inescapable, which turns out to be her own wings, the feathers of flame that grow out of her own body. Still in a dream state, she discovers that beating her wings to put out the flames only fans the blaze, and so she consumes herself, but to no end, the flames somehow sustaining themselves. She not only cannot maintain the various identities she has been assigned, but has lost her sense of self. The fact that she loses her ability to speak seems to affirm this, Dr. Aurelius attributing her silence as having been brought on by emotional trauma. The only thing keeping her going is Coin's promise that she will be allowed to execute Snow, and even that, Katniss realizes, will bring her no peace. Ironically, Katniss only begins to emerge from her overwhelming depression after speaking with Snow, who insists that he is not the one responsible for the bombing that killed Prim. Although Katniss does not necessarily believe his assertion, she feels compelled to learn the truth, so she makes an effort to hang on to her sanity as best she can, using physical pain to help herself maintain focus. Realizing that everyone she likes and trusts is either dead or presently unavailable, she decides to consult with Haymitch about Snow's assertion, only to be mocked by him, an action that drives her back into her depression. Looking for a dim and quiet hidden space where she can curl up, make herself smaller, and try to disappear entirely. She's able to rouse herself the next morning, however, when called upon to perform a final duty as the Mockingjay and execute Snow, officially ending the war. Killing Coin does not cure Katniss, of course, or even improve her symptoms. On the contrary, she becomes suicidal, having nothing left to live for now that Prim is no longer there to be protected and her death has been avenged. Filled with loathing not only for herself but all of humanity, she loses interest in eating, soon becoming thinner and more fragile than she has ever been. She continues to live only because others take action to save her. Once her trial is over, people come to feed and rehydrate her and then carry her like a rag doll to a waiting hovercraft, which takes her back to District 12. The intervention by others proved critical. Upon returning to District 12, Katniss slowly begins to recover. Although she remains inactive, withdrawn, and emotionally numb, she begins to eat again and makes no effort to kill herself, even though she now has the opportunity to do so. Moving only between the kitchen and the bathroom for the most part, she converses with no one, ignoring the phone, leaving her letters unopened, and making no effort to contact her mother. Eventually, she ventures quietly down the hallway, afraid to awaken the ghosts, and in the study she finds her father's hunting jacket, the handwritten book of edible plants her parents made, and various other objects, including her old bows. Seeing these things seemed to trigger something in her, and though she leaves the other objects untouched, she puts on the jacket, moves to the living room, and falls asleep on the sofa. The fact that she does not return to the kitchen to stare into the fire is significant. She's beginning to move forwards rather than remain in stasis. Even the terrible nightmare that follows, a nightmare involving being buried alive beneath shovelfuls of ash thrown by everyone she has ever known who is now dead, signals that she's moving towards recovery. Although the nightmare ends darkly with her mouth being filled with ash so that she cannot speak, when upon awakening she can still hear the scraping of the shovel, she takes action, rushing outdoors to scream at the dead. As it turns out, the scraping of the shovel is caused not by the dead trying to bury her, but by Peeta, who has returned to District 12 and is planting primroses outside of her window in honor of Prim. The suggestion that shovels can be used to plant as well as bury seems to have a positive effect upon Katniss, helping her to realize that life and death are interconnected and that renewal is always possible. Whatever the case, the encounter with Peeta prompts Katniss to take further action. Trembling with weakness and anxiety, she runs upstairs, removes the white rose Snow put there to torment her, and throws it into the embers in the fireplace, where it bursts into flames. Fire beats Rose again, she observes. Then she washes herself for the first time in weeks, burns the clothes she has been wearing, and decides to go hunting. Recovery from severe trauma is no simple matter, of course, and Katniss has a setback after seeing workers gathering the remains of those who were killed in the bombing the previous summer. Reflecting upon everyone she has lost, not just to death but to circumstances, she's overcome again and has to be taken home in one of the carts used to transport the dead and helped to the sofa where she sits in a stupor. Being a survivor involves both resilience and perseverance, of course, something her sister's cat, Buttercup, reminds her of when he suddenly appears in the house and hisses at her, having somehow made it all the way back from District 13. Buttercup serves as a mirror image of Katniss, not only because he is at once standoffish and protective, but because he is self-reliant and because he loves Prim. With this in mind, it should not be too surprising that upon seeing Buttercup, she speaks to him as if she were addressing herself, insisting that Prim is dead, that there's nothing left for him in District 12, that Prim is never coming back here again. As she confronts him, a new sound, part crying, part singing, comes out of her, giving voice to her despair, prompting Buttercup to wail as well. The mutual release of emotion proves therapeutic, Katniss realizing that she wants to survive, even though doing so will require previously unthinkable acts. The next morning, the two again cry together, but this time they comfort each other, and on the strength of this, Katniss is finally able to call her mother on the phone and weep with her as well. Addressing the trauma that results from the loss of her sister directly finally enables Katniss to begin moving beyond it, just as finally grieving for her father allowed her to come to terms with his loss earlier. Whereas before she grieved by herself, however, this time she shares her pain and thus is able to receive support from others and help them in turn. As Katniss's mental state improves, she's able to take further steps towards recovery, celebrating the lives of those she has lost rather than just mourning their passing. With Peeta's help, she creates a book that records all of the details it would be a crime to forget. Rather than make those Katniss mourns objects of pity, the book represents them as people to be admired. Ultimately, the project proves cathartic, she and Peeta crying over it as they write it and promising to live well in order to honor those who have died. Although still damaged, Katniss is able to move on with her life and find some measure of happiness, the book helping to remind her that life can be good again. Katniss can only fully recover from the trauma she has undergone when she finds a way to narrate it, to reconstruct traumatic experiences in ways that gives her mastery over them, helping her to become whole again. According to Suzanne Collins, the Hunger Games trilogy began with the recognition of a connection between reality programming and real-world events such as war. The unsettledness Collins felt seems to result from a number of factors, most obviously a concern with the ways in which popular programming desensitizes people to violence and conflict. She finds reality television particularly disturbing since it often involves people being humiliated or brought to tears or suffering physically. The problem with this, she indicates, is that when audiences see a real tragedy playing out on, say, the news, it doesn't have the impact it should. Collins does more than simply depict a particularly horrific reality television program from the future, however. By presenting the games from the perspective of someone who has both watched them and played them, Collins provides an inside look at the reality genre, one that exposes its social and ideological functions. In particular, she uses Katniss Everdeen's first-hand account of her experiences to suggest that, in addition to providing entertainment, reality programs act as socializing agents, playing an essential role in maintaining the dominant ideology. Though largely unscripted, such programs are constructed, edited, and in some cases digitally altered so as to provide compelling narratives that both affirm prevailing beliefs and naturalize them by embedding them in contexts that represent themselves as real. The Hunger Games' function is to affirm the capital's absolute dominance over the districts through its control of resources. As its very name suggests, the Hunger Games center on scarcity, every resource in the arena being carefully managed by the game makers who represent the capital itself. Rather than simply set up certain rules and parameters and let the games play themselves out, the game makers manage everything from food and water to temperature on an ongoing basis, demonstrating that their power is absolute. In the first book of the trilogy, for example, the game makers use medicine desperately needed by Peeta to induce Katniss into a confrontation with the other players and later cut off water supplies to force the tributes to the lake. The game makers' absolute control over resources in the arena is presumably meant to mirror the capital's control over the resources of Panem, the games thereby reinforcing the existing social order by reproducing it symbolically in the arena. By demonstrating that their control of resources gives them control over people's lives, the capital is able to convey the idea that a widespread rebellion could not possibly be sustained and that uprisings would result in further suffering rather than social change. The capital also uses the games to reinforce the idea that it cannot be resisted physically, occasionally killing tributes just to remind players they can. There is, of course, a critical difference in the ways that the Hunger Games convey their ideological message and the way contemporary reality programs such as Survivor do, which is arguably the most successful of contemporary reality programs. Whereas the ideological content of contemporary reality television is largely determined by market forces, the ideological content of the Hunger Games is determined by a centralized government, and therefore the games serve as a form of state propaganda. Indeed, the capital highlights the ideological significance of the games before they begin by having the mayors of each district read an official history of Panem, which includes an account of an earlier rebellion against the capital and explains what the games exist as a reminder of the capital's powers. As Katniss observes, whatever words they use, the real message is clear. Look how we take your children and sacrifice them, and there's nothing you can do. If you lift a finger, we will destroy every last one of you. The ways in which Collins represents fashion-themed reality programming in the Hunger Games trilogy is also worth considering in detail, since Collins addresses the fashion industry in all three novels, ultimately suggesting that it has a powerful influence on the way people think and act. Indeed, the pre-game programming that documents Katniss's transformation into a sexual object can itself be regarded as commentary on the ideological implications of some reality programs. By exploring the objectification process through the consciousness of Katniss as she is prepared for the games by Cinna and his associates, Collins illustrates the challenge women face in retaining a sense of self while they are being constructed as sexual objects by society at large. The transformation process is presented as being initially shocking to Katniss, both physically and psychologically. Upon arriving in the capital, she is washed down, leaving her feeling like a plucked bird. Katniss feels alienated by rather than appreciative of her transformation, highlighting the sense of vulnerability she feels and describing her team as total idiots. Although she responds much more positively to her stylist Cinna, since he does not seem to regard her as a piece of meat to be prepared for a platter. Gradually, Katniss comes to accept her transformation and even appreciate the fact that being an object of desire affords certain benefits, commenting, "The Hunger Games aren't supposed to be a beauty contest, but the best-looking tributes always seem to pull more sponsors." She manages to retain her sense of self despite her objectification. However, at least until she sees her own reflection just before her interview with Caesar Flickerman. "The creature standing before me in the full-length mirror has come from another world, where skin shimmers and eyes flash, and apparently they make their clothes from jewels. Because my dress, oh my dress, is entirely covered in reflective precious gems. I am not pretty, I am not beautiful, I am as radiant as the sun." As the shift in subject from the creature to I suggests, Katniss internalizes her objectification, regarding herself as a creature. Events that immediately follow confirm this. Once on stage, the previously self-assured, independent young woman becomes a silly girl spinning in a sparkling dress. Upon leaving the stage, however, Katniss quickly regains her perspective, apparently realizing that in allowing herself to be objectified, she has compromised herself and her values. By the time she returns to the training center, her giddiness has become anger, as she assaults Peeta for publicly declaring his desire for her in his interview. In her view, by making her an object of love, he has made her seem foolish and weak. Even though Haymitch eventually convinces Katniss that presenting herself as a heartbreaker gives her the best chance of winning sponsors, going forward she no longer gets caught up in such performances, realizing that it is just a means to an end and not part of who she really is. The same is true in the novels that follow. Whether playing a child bride-to-be in Catching Fire or a superhero-like leader of the rebellion in Mockingjay, she no longer confuses performance with identity. Like an outstanding contestant in a reality show, she has a double consciousness of sorts, existing at once within the games and beyond them, never fully losing her sense of self. The challenges involved in maintaining the double consciousness necessary to succeed in the games becomes most evident in Katniss's relationship with Peeta, a relationship that begins as a showman's, that is, as a romantic relationship that develops within a reality program. In the case of Katniss and Peeta, the showman's is initially strategic, although Peeta has real feelings for Katniss. Katniss, who has no advanced knowledge of the scheme, agrees to play along with it once Haymitch convinces her that perceptions are more important than reality in the games, since in the end they are just a big show. Once they are in the arena, there is initially little opportunity for the two of them to develop their showmans further. It is only after the rules of the games are officially changed to allow for two victors that the showmans become central again, as Katniss plays up the romance in order to obtain gifts from their sponsors. As her relationship with Peeta develops, however, Katniss has increasing difficulty in separating her performance from her real feelings. After nearly dying in an effort to get medicine desperately needed by Peeta, she begins to realize how attached she has become to him, how her need to be with him is no longer about the sponsors, but about him. Eventually, Katniss's recognition that her showmance with Peeta has emerged as the game's primary narrative allows her to manipulate not only the sponsors, but the game makers themselves. So far, we have discussed the Hunger Games' significance in providing the government with the means of reinforcing the idea that they have absolute power over the populace. The games seem to have an additional function in the capital itself, where the decadent population has come to expect the government to provide them with entertainment, just as the citizens of ancient Rome did. Indeed, Collins indicates herself in an interview with her publisher that she had ancient Rome in mind. In keeping with the classical roots, I send my tributes into an updated version of the Roman gladiator games, which entails a ruthless government forcing people to fight to the death as popular entertainment. The world of Panem, particularly the capital, is loaded with Roman references. Panem itself comes from the expression panem et circenses, which translates into bread and circuses. To those living in the capital, it seems the games serve as a form of distraction. Citizens are so caught up in the artificial drama that plays out on television that they pay little attention to the fact that their president is in fact a dictator who attained power by murdering his rivals, or that their affluence comes at the cost of great privation elsewhere. The Hunger Games do more than just distract its viewers on the capital. However, they also affirm the existing political structure by validating the idea that those on top are there because they have proven themselves most worthy, and the idea that ruthlessness is not only acceptable as a means of acquiring power, but even necessary. These ideas seem to pertain not only to the government in relation to the people, but more broadly to capital in relation to the rest of Panem. The games reinforce the idea that those living in the capital are deserving of the privileges they enjoy, privileges denied to those living in the districts, and that their government's ruthlessness in maintaining these privileges is justified. Although Collins draws from the past in order to create a story set in dystopian future, the Hunger Games trilogy is really about the present, as all such fiction is. In particular, Collins seems to be commenting upon present-day world as she sees it, a world that allows itself to be not only distracted by reality television and celebrity drama, but manipulated by it. Artificial drama, it seems, has become more important than real-life suffering, and so suffering continues unacknowledged and unchecked by the very people who benefit from it. More than that, though, Collins suggests that such reality programs have a powerful ideological effect, affirming viewers' sense that they are worthy of the privileges they enjoy and that almost any sort of action can be justified in maintaining them. Like the Hunger Games, these programs accomplish this by dehumanizing people. They stage conflicts, elicit negative behaviors, and then construct narratives around those behaviors that present them as authentic, ultimately suggesting that people get what they deserve. In that sense, the Hunger Games offers incisive satire of reality television shows, targeting tropes such as the makeover and romance. The Hunger Games trilogy does more than just parody shows we're able to see on our screens. It also offers indirect commentary on the ways in which such programming influences people's beliefs and behaviors through its representation of the Hunger Games as an ideological agent. More than that, though, the trilogy serves as a form of media criticism, one of Collins's primary concerns being how to make her readers more conscious of the way media informs their thinking. In particular, she hopes to help them differentiate between what is real and what is not real by exposing reality television's political and ideological functions in her work. By presenting a detailed account of the ways in which reality programming affects the way in which her protagonist thinks and acts, Collins demonstrates how accepting what one sees on television at face value makes one vulnerable to manipulation and control. Ultimately, Collins suggests that the only way to protect oneself is by approaching things critically, by recognizing that even unscripted, reality-based programming are constructions, and that as such they reflect the beliefs and values of their producers. Collins also presents a critique of mass media on a personal level, demonstrating through Katniss how it can be used to control people's beliefs and behaviors, as well as how it can be resisted and even appropriated and used for other purposes. In The Hunger Games and Catching Fire, the focus is on reality television, Collins suggesting that the genre is not so real as it appears. To Katniss, the Hunger Games are a part of her everyday life, the games being required viewing for everyone in Panem. Although she recognizes that the games are used by the government both to affirm their political power over the districts and keep the people divided against one another, she only develops a true critical perspective on the games when she becomes a participant in them, seeing them for what they really are, elaborate fictions that present themselves as fact. With this realization, she is able to master the games themselves, taking control of the narrative and rewriting it, as it were, so that both she and Peeta can survive. She goes even further in Catching Fire, ending the games themselves by destroying the force field that surrounds the arena and escaping to District 13. In Mockingjay, Katniss is able to apply the lessons she learned in the Hunger Games to real life by refusing to play a passive role in the complex narrative Alma Coin, Plutarch Heavensbee, and others create for her. Although she initially agrees to be the Mockingjay, Katniss eventually realizes that doing so involves sacrificing what little agency she has, and so she abandons the role, deserting the Star Squad and pursuing President Snow on her own. After the fall of the Capitol, she returns to District 13 and briefly becomes the Mockingjay again. This time, however, she refuses to follow the script others provide her with, assassinating Coin on live television rather than executing Snow as she is supposed to, thereby changing the course of history. The final Hunger Games that Coin had planned for the children of the Capitol's most powerful people are cancelled, and the cycle of vengeance can end. In addition to addressing the ways in which mass media influences people's beliefs and behaviors and how that influence might be countered, Collins offers implicit commentary on what is happening in media today. Rather than make any effort to be objective or alternatively to represent diverse points of view, the Capitol uses various types of programming to reinforce its own power. State-controlled news programs, for example, convey misinformation by manipulating footage and having reporters present stories that serve the government's interests, and clips from the Hunger Games are rebroadcasted in order to remind people continually of the state's overwhelming power. Once the rebellion begins, war footage is added, accompanied by stories designed to reassure loyalists while demoralizing rebels, and Peeta is forced to undermine the rebels in scripted interviews with Caesar Flickerman. Collins suggests that the problem with our lives being permeated with media, it seems, is that we lose agency, becoming viewers rather than actors. By constructing a highly elaborate fictional world that readers access through a first-person narrator who provides events in the present tense, Collins makes it possible for her readers to experience things along with Katniss, to participate in the action, as it were. This sort of approach has become increasingly common in dystopias directed primarily at younger people, the text itself becoming a space that sometimes tries to create conditions for young readers to rehearse, actively, almost playfully, a way of reflective thinking that focuses on asking questions, discovering analyses, and hypothetically testing out solutions at their own pace in an imaginative environment that is affirming and supportive, but which also articulates dark truths. Although the people living in the capital do not suffer anywhere near the same sort of privation those in the districts do, it becomes increasingly clear as the story proceeds that the capital is a dystopia in its own right. Despite the city's relative affluence, physical beauty, and technological advancement, as Katniss discovers, the people there are nearly as oppressed as those in the districts, the primary difference being those in the capital are either disinterested or unaware of their condition. Although they presumably have more day-to-day freedom than those in the districts, being allowed by the government to visit the sites of past Hunger Games, for example, they have no more say in their political leadership than those living in the districts do, Snow being the undisputed ruler of everyone. As Plutarch observes in Mockingjay, the government manages the capital's population by providing them with bread and circuses, offering full bellies and entertainment in exchange for power. Collins also uses the capital to offer indirect commentary upon materialism, which, in her view, has resulted in debilitating decadence. One of the problems with decadence is that it leads to dependency. If the denizens of the capital have plenty of food, material goods, and luxury items, it is only because the people in the districts have very little. The fact that plenitude has made them weak becomes evident when the capital is under siege. Being entirely dependent upon the workers in the districts for food and material goods, and peacekeepers for security, the citizens of the capital have no means of protecting themselves or their way of life and can only retreat into the town center and hope to be taken care of by the government. Panem serves primarily as a warning about what might happen in the future because of environmental degradation, the political use of mass media, and a government that rules through division and fear. The districts and the capital are not the only nightmarish societies featured in the Hunger Games trilogy. For in Mockingjay, District 13 emerges as a third and in some ways even more frightening dystopia than Panem. Ironically, District 13 first seems to be more of a utopia than a dystopia in the sense that people have a shared sense of purpose and have their basic needs taken care of during a time of crisis by a government that has broad popular support. Although things may be difficult in the short term because of the ongoing war with the capital, the people make sacrifices in the present for the hope of a better future. Indeed, they seem to believe that democracy will resume once the war is over, an attitude reflected by Plutarch, who declares, "We're going to form a republic where the people of each district and the capital can elect their own representatives in a centralized government." Although Katniss remains skeptical about the possibility of District 13 ever becoming a free society, she concedes that it has little choice but to closely regulate resources and behaviors by rationing food, assigning personal quarters, and even tattooing daily schedules on people's forearms. Maybe they are militaristic, overly programmed, and somewhat lacking in sense of humor. They're here and willing to take on the capital. Certainly, Katniss has good reason for sympathizing with the difficulties District 13 faces. Because of its near obliteration in its war with the capital, District 13 has been in perpetual crisis for 75 years, surviving only through the strict sharing of resources, strenuous discipline, and constant vigilance against any further attack from the capital. As Katniss quickly learns, though, even though the district's leader Alma Coin styles herself president, she is in fact a dictator, reserving final say for herself in everything from military strategies to Finnick Odair's wedding. Mockingjay in particular addresses larger ethical questions such as whether the killing of non-combatants is justified while pursuing a military objective, and whether the enemy's depravities can be used to justify the depravities of one's own. District 13's willingness to kill combatants and non-combatants alike during the Siege of the Nut in District 2 and its implementation of terror weapons like the exploding gifts that ultimately kill Prim are cases in point. In many ways, District 13 has come to resemble the very enemy it denounces as evil, employing similar tactics and strategies. As if to confirm this, Collins not only names the president of District 13 Coin, as in two sides of the same coin, but relating her to President Snow through a pun, describing her eyes being the color of slush that you wish would melt away. The Hunger Games trilogy offers more than just a highly engaging cautionary tale about global warming, mass media, and political oppression. In addition to identifying problems, the trilogy considers solutions, the latter two volumes in particular helping readers to imagine how social change might be affected. As noted earlier in the Hunger Games, Katniss has little political consciousness and indeed seems to have little patience for Gale's analysis of the game's ideological function, describing it as ranting. It is only after meeting with President Snow and catching fire that Katniss begins to realize fully how the games function as a means of ideological control and how such control might be resisted. Although many of her earlier actions have political implications, notably decorating Rue's body with flowers and using poisonous berries to alter her first Hunger Games outcome, they are not done for political reasons. In Catching Fire, her political consciousness develops quickly as she sees more of Panem and sees how various districts and their populations interact with one another and the capital. Her first conscious political act occurs during her private session with the game makers in preparation for the Quarter Quell, when she labels the target dummy with the name of the head game maker, Seneca Crane, who had been executed, bloodies it would die, and hangs it by the neck. As she explains to Peeta afterwards, her actions had a specific purpose: to show the game makers she's more than just a piece in their games. Katniss soon learns that it is not just the game makers and the capital that want to use her. At the end of Catching Fire, she learns that she was but a piece in the rebels' elaborate plan to begin a civil war by disrupting the Quarter Quell, and towards the beginning of Mockingjay she becomes cognizant of the fact that she's being used by President Coin to enhance her own power. Her realization Coin is again using her when she coerces her and the other surviving victors to vote on whether to hold another Hunger Games ultimately leads her to take action, to assert that she is a subject rather than an object and do what is right rather than what she's told to do. Rather than shoot Snow as she is expected to, she shoots Coin, ending the cycle of violence and retribution that has dominated Panem for at least 75 years. Collins' hope here appears to be that her readers too will begin to look at the government and situations throughout the world and wonder if they are moral or not. More than that though, she hopes they will take action. One of the Hunger Games trilogy's primary messages involves the environment, which has been severely damaged by pollution and war. Rather than present readers with a history of the future, that is, with a detailed account of how the Earth came to be a broken planet, Collins instead only hints at what has happened in North America over the course of hundreds of years, never being specific. Although we eventually learned that civilization as we know it has ended because environmental damage has resulted in droughts, floods, fires, the destruction of the upper atmosphere, and rising sea levels, we are never provided with specific detail or even told what happens to other parts of the world. Providing such information would change the very nature of the trilogy, of course, since the narrator herself knows almost nothing about Panem's past or the present state of the world, the government controlling knowledge as carefully as it controls resources such as food and energy. We learn about the world in which Katniss lives only as she does, sharing her consciousness, as it were, as she sees every district of Panem for the first time through a train window. By presenting Katniss's dystopia on a personal level rather than a political one, Collins is able to help readers imagine what living in a radically degraded environment might be like. To Katniss, who lives hundreds of years in the future, the consequences of global warming are a part of her everyday life. She and others suffer in the future because of decisions we're making now. To the extent that readers identify with her and her situation, they feel what she feels and in a sense experience what she does. As a result, the trilogy rarely seems preachy or pedantic. It shows us what may happen in the future rather than tell us. Only once does Collins comment directly on the causes of the environmental damage through Katniss, having her observe that the people responsible for the damage clearly didn't care about what would happen to the people who came after them. The fact that Collins is so rarely didactic makes her commentary that much more powerful when it does occur. As previously mentioned, Suzanne Collins readily identifies herself as a war writer. What is surprising perhaps is how uncompromising Collins is when it comes to depicting war. Collins' narrative is unflinching. Not one shred of wartime realism is sacrificed in order to shield younger readers. The Hunger Games trilogy does not express ambivalence towards war, at least when read in its entirety, since it is difficult to regard the final volume Mockingjay as being anything but an anti-war novel. That Mockingjay makes war its subject is clear from the very beginning, the novel opening in a killing field. Through Katniss, who returns to District 12 for the first time since it was firebombed by the Capitol, Collins provides readers with a panoramic view of a Holocaust. As Katniss moves from the remains of the home she grew up in to the sea of grey that covers most of the district, we see along with her how an entire community has been destroyed. Collins does not allow her readers to remain detached from the destruction. However, having Katniss describe how piles of ash shift here and there in response to her footsteps and how a skull that she initially mistook for a rock makes her wonder how her own skull would look. Katniss even considers her own culpability in the massacre since it appears to have been triggered by her escape from the Quarter Quell arena. As she passes bodies in various states of decomposition, she thinks, "I killed you, and you, and you." By opening the novel in such a manner, Collins suggests that the human costs of war are almost beyond comprehension. Katniss can think about the war and contemplate its consequences, but the horror can never be reduced to words or thoughts. Accordingly, just contemplating what has happened in District 12 induces a somatic response in Katniss. It is not the billowing ash that makes her choke as she runs through the town so much as the thought of who she's breathing in. Collins also presents the ethical complexities of war as being almost beyond comprehension through Katniss. Unlike Gale, who wants only to avenge the destruction of his home, telling Katniss that if he could, he would hit a button and kill every living soul working for the Capitol, Katniss reflects on the significance of what has happened and wants no part of killing for the sake of revenge. This is not to suggest that she does not feel bitterness or anger towards the capital, or that a desire for retribution plays no part in her decision to become active in the rebellion. When she thinks about Rue's death, Gale being whipped, and the destruction of her home district, her blood turns hot. Ultimately, her decision to become the Mockingjay is rational rather than emotional. However, she only resolves to do so after she realizes that she cannot allow things to go back to the way they were, that the capital can no longer be allowed to control populations through terror, starve them into submission, or engage in mass killings. Ironically, upon joining the rebellion, Katniss becomes party to all of these things, since the rebellion's tactics mirror those of the capital, as it becomes evident during the siege of District 2 and the capital. Collins' point here seems to be that no matter what the cause, war cannot be approached in an ethical manner. Katniss does not join the conflict blindly, of course. Having seen the ruins of District 12, she knows full well what war entails. To her, the ends justify the means. However, at least in the early part of the novel, she joins the rebellion knowing that as the Mockingjay, every public action on her part is likely to bring about suffering and loss of life. More than that, her statement to the capital, "If we burn, you burn with us," indicates that she accepts the position put forth by Gale that since its cause is just, the rebellion has the right to use any tactic the capital does, including those that result in civilian casualties. She even seems to approve of weapons that target non-combatants, including things like the booby-trapping of water supplies and what appears to be safe havens, apparently drawing the line only at weapons that exploit people's more humane impulses, like bombs designed to kill people who rush to the aid of the wounded. Having witnessed cruelty and suffering for her entire life, Katniss is not at all squeamish about death and is perfectly willing to kill, at least when she considers it necessary. Having said that, it is significant that she takes no particular pleasure in killing and later feels tremendous guilt for her role in bringing about the deaths of others. Katniss is not a static character, and although she continues to accept in principle the idea that killing is necessary in war, her judgment about when it can be justified changes. In other words, she begins to think that the ends may justify certain means, but not any means. This becomes clear when Gale proposes neutralizing the capital's primary military base, the Nut, which is contained in a mountain, by blocking its exits and suffocating those within. Although initially inclined to support the plan, her hatred of the capital being so strong because of what they did to District 12, making her want to see everyone in the mountain dead, she remembers that she's a girl from District 12 and not someone like President Snow who will do absolutely anything in order to achieve his ends. As someone who lost her own father in a mine accident, she cannot justify condemning others to a similar fate. Ultimately, she acquiesces, however, donning her Mockingjay outfit so that she will be ready to play her part when an opportunity for a propo arises. Once Gale's plan is executed and thousands of people die, Katniss realizes that she's morally culpable even though she initially objected to the attack, since her contributions to the war effort helped put the rebellion in a position to bring the capital's main base under siege. Imagining the hell inside the mountain that must have followed the attack leads to her to remember in detail the day her own father died buried within a mountain. Reflecting upon what has transpired, Katniss asks herself reprovingly, what did we just do? As her use of the word we suggests, she takes responsibility for the killing of those within the mountain, even though she publicly challenged the decision to trap the people within it. To be part of a war effort is to share in the responsibility for everything that happens during the war, even things of which one might not personally approve. From this point onward, Katniss is no longer able to commit herself to the war, either intellectually or emotionally, continuing in her role as the Mockingjay only because doing so would put her in a better position to kill President Snow. Although she hates the capital as much as she ever has, she's no longer willing to wage war against it by killing people from other districts. Told by Haymitch to make a speech encouraging supporters of the capital to surrender after the Nut has been neutralized, Katniss breaks from the script when 2 trainloads of armed survivors from the Nut appear before her in front of the Justice Building. Rather than continue her speech, she runs towards them, yelling to the rebels on the rooftops to hold their fire. When one of the survivors points a gun to her head and demands that she give him a reason for not shooting her, she can only reply that there is none, adding, "That's the problem, isn't it? We blew up your mine, you burned my district to the ground, we've got every reason to kill each other." Disarming herself, she continues to speak, observing that the killing goes around and around and nobody wins except for the capital, and then asserting that she's tired of being a piece in their games. Although she does not yet say it, her refusal to simply repeat the speech Haymitch provides her with suggests that she's no longer willing to be a piece in District 13's games either. Having seen that in pursuing their interests, the rebels can be as brutal and inhumane as the Capitol, she decides to act independently of them, pursuing her own personal vendetta rather than the rebel cause. Finally, a free agent, she pursues her own agenda, committing what amounts to an act of treason against the very cause she joined voluntarily earlier. Although no longer a District 13 soldier, Katniss is nonetheless in a position to witness the ongoing war firsthand as she continues moving towards the city center to find Snow. As before, when surveying the ruins of District 12, Katniss relates the horrors of war directly, the key difference being that in this case she not only reports upon events but participates in them. Almost immediately the streets become a battlefield as gunfire rips through the crowd and some of the people near her slump to the ground. After taking cover, Katniss looks around and sees a little girl in a lemon-yellow coat who kneels beside a motionless woman screeching and trying to rouse her. As she watches, another wave of bullets slices across the chest of her yellow coat, staining it red, knocking the girl onto her back. Looking at the girl's tiny, crumpled form, Katniss is overcome by horror, unable to speak. Her horror deepens as she realizes that it is the rebels who have been shooting into the crowd, killing peacekeepers and refugees alike. As the battle continues, she becomes a killer of innocents herself. Rather than retreat, take cover, or help others as best she can, she begins to kill indiscriminately. Peacekeepers, rebels, citizens, who knows, everything that moves is a target. People shoot reflexively, and I'm no exception. Heart pounding, adrenaline burning through me, everyone is my enemy. There's nothing to do but move forward, killing whoever comes in our path. By presenting it in such terms, Collins denies Katniss any glory. She's a murderer more than a hero, killing others, whether friend or enemy, adult or child, not only to save herself, but to pursue a personal vendetta. She has, in short, become exactly the sort of person she herself despises, a person like Snow or Coin who will do whatever she has to achieve her ends. As a dynamic character whose attitudes develops and changes over the course of the Hunger Games trilogy, Katniss provides readers with the means of thinking through the costs of war, not only to society, but to the individual. In the opening volumes of the trilogy, Katniss is a heroic character, in the sense that she not only defies powers that are greater than herself, but also risks everything in order to help others. Once she joins the military, however, she becomes a different person, not only because of what she sees, but because of what she does. To fight in war is to murder innocent people, something that, as Peeta notes, costs everything you are. Fighting may seem exciting, Collins suggests, even glamorous, but in the end it is just murder, something Katniss learns only when it is too late. In addition to witnessing how terrible war is, Katniss sees how those who promote war use the media in order to manufacture consent for it. One obvious way of accomplishing this is through the control of information, something the Capitol does by isolating the districts from one another and monopolizing mass communication. As a result, it can limit what people know about other places and make organized resistance impossible, at least on a national level. The Capitol generates fear in part by pushing people severely for even the most minor offenses and instilling in them a sense that they may be under observation at any time. To Katniss, District 13 initially seems very different from Panem, since its leader, Alma Coin, rules with the consent of the governed, the district being, at least nominally, a democracy. Katniss quickly learns, however, that the government of District 13 controls information just as carefully as the Capitol does, albeit more subtly. The fact that people can be critical of the government does not make District 13 a free society. However, even though it has to allow a certain level of dissent so that it can present itself as an alternative to the repressive Capitol, Coin and her government are just as controlling in their own way as the Capitol is. Like the Capitol, District 13 has a monopoly on mass communications, and it uses television programming to shape people's environments and thereby control their beliefs and actions, something Katniss learns firsthand as the Mockingjay. Being the Mockingjay, it turns out, is no different than being the girl who was on fire. In both cases, her words, actions, and appearances are managed by others so as to achieve certain effects. The effect District 13 hopes to achieve is to make the girl who not only survived 2 Hunger Games but openly defied the Capitol and its power into a symbol of the revolution. As it turns out, their propaganda broadcasts featuring Katniss as the Mockingjay are extremely effective, helping the rebels to take District 3 and 11 and make significant advances in several other districts. The propos are also based on a fundamental lie, however, one that Katniss is aware of from the start. She's no rebel leader, even though she plays one for the cameras, Coin reserving all real power for herself. The question Katniss is forced to consider is whether such a lie is justified. Is it acceptable for her to manipulate people by playing the Mockingjay when doing so is likely to lead to the deaths of thousands? When she initially agrees to be the Mockingjay, she does so despite her reservations because she has decided that the Capitol must be defeated at all costs. As she comes to realize that, in many ways, District 13 is just as bad as the Capitol, however, her opinion begins to change and eventually she leaves the rebellion to pursue her own agenda and kill Snow. The Hunger Games trilogy does more than introduce young readers to the horror of war. The books also take readers inside the mechanisms of propaganda and manipulation and how resistance can subvert these powerful tools of control. Through Katniss's experiences as a media figure in both the Capitol and District 13, readers see how media can be used to control people's thoughts and behaviors. They also learn through her that individual action can make a difference, and that one does not have to accept things as they are. Even the little acts of resistance like covering Rue's body with flowers have great significance if only because it shows that resistance is possible, and Katniss's later actions like refusing to be the sole survivor of her first Hunger Games or destroying the force field that surrounds the Court of Quell Arena lead to open resistance to the Capitol in some districts and even uprisings. Katniss's final act as the Mockingjay makes the biggest difference of all. Of course, since shooting Coin rather than Snow in front of all Panem changes everything forever. Making Katniss's actions even more remarkable is the fact that she takes responsibility for it. She knows full well that killing the president will most likely lead to public execution, but to her the public good has become more important than the private. In effect, she sacrifices herself for peace in a way that parallels how so many others in Panem and District 13 sacrifice themselves for war. War will only end, Collins seems to suggest, when people are willing to do anything for peace. At the core of all dystopias, including Hunger Games, is a very human question: how people really behave. The best dystopias ask the essential questions: why is this so? Does it need to be so? And who says this must be so? Through dystopias, readers can begin to experience what it means to be human, with all the despair and hope that this implies. Readers need to balance despair with hope so that they can move forward and enact change, just as Katniss does. The emotion in the final pages of Mockingjay is exhaustion, not joy or peace. It is because ending the novel any other way would undercut the trilogy's message about the need to take action to prevent places like Panem from coming into being in the future. As dark as the ending of the Hunger Games trilogy is, with Katniss still having to remind herself of every act of kindness she has ever witnessed in order to survive, the world has nonetheless become a better place because of her actions and place in which she is willing to have children herself after all. The nebulous conclusion of the Hunger Games series is a fitting illustration of what makes the series as a whole so remarkable. Rather than leading its readers to a set, cut-and-dried moral, the series treats revolution and war with the same ambiguity they have in life, with none of its characters fully culpable or fully innocent, and no conclusions fully satisfying. Other popular YA series of great depth and nuance tend to divide their characters' worlds and the characters who populate them into good versus evil. And at the opening of the series, the Hunger Games characters too seem to be clearly divided between good and bad in the comfortable and expected dichotomy. The Hunger Games begins to chip away at its own veneer of a morally simplistic, easily delineated Panem right away. The pages that follow are full of one destroyed preconception after another. Although a number of readers dislike the openness of the ending, it is a fitting close to the Hunger Games series. We are left with more loose ends than answers. The biggest question, though, and one that affects all of the rest, is what happened to Panem? And through that unique transformative process of interaction with the text and interaction with others who love the Hunger Games, we discover that the question of what happened to Panem after the rebellion is, in fact, the same question with which the series began, lingering still after turning the final page. How could the Hunger Games ever become accepted? How could our world fall so far as to think of killing children as entertainment? The final question behind the Hunger Games series, one that we attempt to answer over and over again, is not what happened to Panem, but what's happening to us. If you made it so far, thank you so much for watching and listening. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the longer format of these videos in the comments below as I try something new this time. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up to help with the YouTube algorithm and consider subscribing so you don't miss out on future content. Thank you once again for your support. This was Heads and Tails. Till next time.